Okay, so we have had released recently the report for the British Social Attitude Survey 36. That is data from 2018. Survey that's been going since 1983, and duly every year they have certain themes, and this year they have as one of their themes religion. The British Social Attitude Survey is, I suppose, the premier survey of its kind as a social and cultural survey of attitudes and opinions of the people within the United Kingdom and their beliefs. And there are some questions that they ask every year, as you will see. There are other questions that they ask on a regular but infrequent basis, and certain questions on religion are part of that. And some of those were first asked in 1998, then in 2008, and now again in 2018. So you will see those are some of the comparisons that are being made. What I want to do in this video is that I want to go through this section. There's quite a lot. It's about a 25-page section, so I'm going to prune some of it down to make it more amenable to this video, but I also want to add some value and give you some other data that's not within that. Okay, so that's what I want to try and do, and to try and make the video as short as I can, but there's still quite a lot to fit in. I hope you'll appreciate that. Okay, so let's get straight down to it, and this is what they lead with, this chart, which is a chart that we've seen before that effectively shows this somewhat precipitous decline in Christianity in the United Kingdom and the consequent rise of those with no religion, and also the increase of those with non-Christian religions, which is a feature largely of immigration, it turns out. But this is not the best of graphs. This is a better graph that somebody else prepared. And let me try and explain what you're seeing here, because this shows you the dynamics of what is taking place in the UK. And really there are two effects taking place. One is involving the incumbent population, by which I mean people who were born in this country and whose parents live in this country. And effectively there is a constant erosion with people not maintaining, not carrying on the religion of their parents, and that is what has accounted for the decline of the Church of England and also the Church of Scotland, etc. in that graph. But then there is a migration, a migratory effect, and if you think about it, people who are emigrating from the UK, they are largely either older Anglicans who are taking that with them, or they are people with no religion. But the net immigration is almost always, because most other countries are more religious than the UK, they're almost always more religious than the people that are already within the UK, and so that is increasing those populations. And of course, most Anglicans aren't immigrating from elsewhere because they're already within the UK. So that's not helping the Church of England, Church of Scotland, etc. But it is helping the Catholic Church. For quite some time, I wondered whether in some ways Catholicism in the UK was more resistant to this generational attrition process that Anglicanism was suffering. We know that that is not the case, and I'll show you a graph a little bit later on in this video that demonstrates that effectively this is immigration from places like Eastern Europe, Poland, etc., that have large Catholic populations that are keeping that topped up. That also accounts for the growth in Christian non-denominational groups and the Islam Muslim group. You can see by this then that we've got these two things in tension, because the decline of Church of England can't carry on forever because it's getting down to really, really small numbers. And given that that is what is increasing the no religion side, we're going to reach a kind of equilibrium point where the no religion doesn't grow very much more, because immigration is constantly keeping the religious numbers up. Somebody had a look at all of this and tried to anticipate the position of how things will look in 2040. Okay, so that's what they did. They looked at where people are, the younger people 20 to 30 in the UK, and they had a look at the sort of immigration factors and worked out where it would be. And it had the no religion up to 63%, and I think it might kind of equalize at about that. That really wouldn't surprise me. Catholicism as the biggest Christian denomination, Muslims up at 7%, Muslims up there at 8%, And you might at this point want to think at some of the things that I was showing you in my previous video, actually thinking where those Muslims are coming from, those Muslims who immigrate from other countries, and how irreligiosity is increasing in those countries. So maybe that could be a factor as well to figure in. Church of England as well, down at 4%, but a different character to the Church of England, with an evangelical hardcore making up the bulk of the Church of England, rather than the more moderate traditional Church of England that we have at the moment. That has significant impacts when you consider the special status that the Church of England has in the UK. Maybe we'll get to talk a little bit more about that later on. That gives you an idea of the background. Now, this was the overview that they gave in the British Social Attitude Survey. I won't read it all out, but a couple of key points that I want to mention. Those who do not regard themselves as belonging to a religion are increasingly secular. That is likely to say they are very or extremely unreligious. Couple that with this consolidation of attendance. The proportion that report they attend at least weekly or less often, but at least monthly, has remained stable at around 11 and 7% respectively. This is something that we see throughout this entire report, actually, is effectively a polarization. Of course, people who say they have no religion can still believe in God and still have those attitudes towards religion. It seems that there is less and less of that taking place, and a greater proportion of those who have no religion are saying no, they don't believe in God, they're not religious, and they're taking a harder line stance against religion. But at the same stage, those who do have a religion seem to be a more hardcore group. They take it more seriously. The attrition has been in this middle ground, the people who claim to have a religion but really just give it lip service on one hand, and then people who say they have no religion but still have quite spiritual, religious God beliefs and still quite benevolent attitudes towards religion. That is the ground that's getting stretched, and things are becoming a little bit more polarized. Okay. There's then quite a long introduction, and I don't really want to read all of it out, but what I do want to read out is this one section that just gives you some idea of how much things have changed over the last century or so in Britain with regard to religion. Okay, in Britain, church attendance has declined steadily since at least 1851. When a government count showed about half the population in church on a particular Sunday. The figure derived from a recent clergy count is around 6%. In 1900, church membership was around 25%. It is now less than 10%. In 1900, more than half of age-relevant population attended Sunday schools. Now it is less than 4%. Similar declines are visible in the use of religious offices to mark rites of passage. This amazed me, this. In the 19th century, around 90% of Scottish weddings were religious. In 2017, the figure was 30%. And in 2012, there were more humanist than Catholic weddings. Before the Second World War, the Church of England was baptising 3/4 of the English population. The figure is now 15%. So I think that gives you some idea of just how much things have changed over the larger time period. Of course, the time period for the BSA survey is from 1983 onwards, and duly the first table of data they give us is effectively the table of data that created that graph that we were looking at earlier on. And it is quite stark when you see the numbers. No religion, 1983, 31% has jumped up to 52%. So that's an extra fifth of the population now have no religion. Well within my lifetime, Church of England has gone from 40% down, precipitous decline, down to 12% in 2018. And as you will see, that 12% is heavily propped up from very, very old people. Let me read the paragraph that goes along with this, because it gives some interesting talking points. Wider research suggests that Britain is becoming more secular, not because adults are losing their religion or inclination to practice, but because old people with an attachment to the Church of England and other Christian denominations are gradually being replaced in the population by unaffiliated younger people. To put it another way, listen to this bit. Religious decline in Britain is generational. People tend to be less religious than their parents, and on average their children are even less religious than they are. Let me show you a couple of graphs, not sourced from this survey but from elsewhere, which just demonstrate that. Look at the red line here. We've got different sort of 15 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, different age groups, and you can see how no religion in the younger age groups is so much more prevalent than it is from those 75 and over. And the slope of that graph is kind of mirrored from the Church of England going in the other direction. The Church of England has all but died out in the 15 to 24 year olds, and yet is still very, very significant in those 75 years and over. But perhaps you may have thought, well, that is because people get more religious as they get older, but that is not the case. This is not an age effect, it's a cohort effect. So here are the cohorts, people born in these different 10-year age bands, and you can see that by and large they maintain the levels of religiosity. This is showing you the percentages with no religious affiliation, and you can see the change is that people born more recently are just less religious. It's not that as the years go on, people's levels of religiosity increases or their levels of irreligiosity decreases. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. This is what it carries on to say. Two non-religious parents successfully transmit their lack of religious parents, whereas two religious parents only have roughly a 50-50 chance of passing on the faith. One religious parent does only half as well as two together. To borrow the terminology of radioactive decay, institutional religion in Britain now has a half-life of one generation. I love that analogy there. This was the graph that I told you I was going to show you a little bit earlier on here. And what it shows there is you can see Anglicanism. It's showing you the current religion versus the religion people were brought up in. And you can see that if you were brought up in an Anglican household, you only have a 52% chance of being an Anglican yourself. If you were brought up in a Catholic household, you have a 56% chance of being a Catholic. And it's the same dire figures for people in other Christian denominations. Now you will see, for non-Christian denominations, they fare considerably better. It's an open point. We don't know whether this is because these non-Christian religions are simply more resistant, or it's simply a sort of cultural fact that their religion is more closely tied with their cultural affiliations, and of course by being minority groups within the culture they tend to maintain those closer bonds. But 85% of those in the non-Christian group manage to maintain the religion of their parents, and indeed it tells us here in the survey that 93% of those brought up as Muslims still identify as Muslims. However, as it says here, retention is highest among people brought up with no religion. At 24%, they are just as numerous as people raised as Anglicans, but nearly all of them, 94%, inherit their parents' lack of affiliation. There is little evidence of adults who are not raised with a religion later acquiring one. The 6% figure is similar to that reported by other research. Okay, so you can see that there is a big trend here, which is effectively, certainly for Christianity, it's very much a one-way track, regardless of the Christian denomination. Even if you have two Christian parents, there is a sort of 50% chance that you will not be a Christian, whereas if you have two parents who have no religion, it's almost a certainty that you will have no religion. The next thing that it shows, it gives a little graph here that just shows you the precipitous decline that I was talking about with the Church of England. Have a look at these figures here. 75 plus, 33% of the population of that age regard themselves as affiliated to the Church of England. In the 18 to 24 category, we are down at 1%. This is the state religion we are talking about. And in this 18 to 24 category, only 1% of those regard themselves as affiliated to that religion. And that becomes important in a minute when I describe this next graph. Table 2, self-assessed religiosity. They asked all the respondents to describe themselves through from very or extremely religious through to very or extremely non-religious. Now, the first thing I want to point out is look at this. Somewhat non-religious has actually dropped since 98 from 13% to 11%. But what has really grown is the very or extremely non-religious has grown from 14% to 33%. So either people are becoming more definitive in their beliefs, or they regard it as more culturally acceptable. Now it's more commonplace. Now we're not living in a country that is overwhelmingly religious to just explicitly say, you're not having to play part of the game anymore. And people were happy now with the idea that they're just not religious and that is the end of it. But also at the other end, very or extremely religious, the percentage has remained roughly the same, 6% 1998, 7% in 2018. Now, some of that may be because of these non-Christian religions which seem to have a stronger religious core. But again, let me draw you back to what we were talking about with that evangelical core within the Church of England, which isn't necessarily growing, but it is growing as a proportion of the Church of England. Let me read you something from a piece entitled How Anglicans Tip the Brexit Vote from Greg Smith of the William Temple Foundation and Linda Woodhead at Lancaster University. This was discussing within regard to Brexit and the fact that Anglicans had with regard to that. But what they're trying to juxtapose in this piece is the opinions of Justin Welby, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury and is from the evangelical wing of the Church of England, and how his views did not seem to gel with the typical Anglican who isn't from the evangelical wing. But this is what they wrote at the end of that piece. As an evangelical, Justin Welby's views reflect the views of British evangelicalism more generally. Evangelicalism is increasingly influential among bishops and senior clergy in the Church of England, but appeals to only a tiny minority of the laity. Over time, as older, more traditional Anglicans die out and the Church of England continues its precipitous decline, the balance may change. In the process, the Church of England, from a moderate religion of the people to a more sectarian religion for an evangelical minority, in that case, the views of church leaders will eventually prevail over those of the laity. It's important, this point. This has real social ramifications for the United Kingdom here. You can look at that figure, that prediction of the Church of England only accounting for 3 or 4% of the population, and say, well, what does it matter if it has a more evangelical, hardcore approach to religion? The reason that it matters is that the Church of England controls thousands and thousands and thousands of state-funded schools. So if the character of the Church of England changes, then the schools, the state-funded schools that our children go to, that my boy will be going to, he is going to a Church of England school as his first school, because those are the schools that are available where I live. If the character of the Church of England changes, but they still have control of those schools that are funded by the state, then that is important. The Church of England has special status. It has the Lord Spiritual. Bishops sit in our upper chamber as of right. The Church of England is guaranteed spaces. That is something that makes sense when 70 or 80% perhaps of the population are affiliated to the Church of England. But when it is a hardcore 4% radical evangelical group, then that is an absolute oddity there. That is the situation that we're going down with regard to that. That is why I single that out, and that is something that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, moving on with the report. Reading from the report. The secular population is changing in a direction that may be unexpected. As it becomes more acceptable to say that you have no religion, even vaguely religious people who in the past would have identified themselves as belonging to the Church of England or another group no longer do so. Hence, the non-religious category is more inclusive now than in the past. It does not consist solely of highly educated atheists and agnostics. Some commentators, especially in the USA, claim that the rapid increase in having no religion is merely a sign of dissatisfaction with the churches. In their view, these people are actually or potentially religious, but simply see themselves as nothing in particular at the moment. Okay, in contrast to that, it goes on to say, if that was the case, we might expect to find the average level of belief among the religious nones to be higher than before. In fact, as Table 3 shows, those who do not have a religious affiliation are far more likely to say they are non-religious now than they were in 1998. Now, 73% of those who state they have no religion describe themselves as non-religious, while 15% describe themselves as somewhat religious and 58% extremely very non-religious. So you can see there, of those that don't identify with a religion, those who say they are very extremely somewhat non-religious, it was 49% of that population in 98, and now it is 73% in 2018. So this is a key point here, and I think that differentiates the rise of the nons in the United States with regard to the UK. As you may remember if you watch my video on the USA, it does appear that there are quite a lot of religious nons in the United States who do not affiliate with a religion, but they still affiliate with sort of religious thinking and belief in God, etc., etc. Whereas that doesn't appear to be the case here. In fact, it seems to be the other way, that not only have we got a greater percentage of people in the UK who do not identify with a particular religion, but a higher percentage of that percentage are vehemently non-religious, rather than having just kind of some religious belief but not being particularly sure what it is. Then goes on to say this, right, to just show you how it's a generational thing as well in this terms. Nearly 2/3, 64% of respondents with no religion aged less than 45 say that they are very or extremely unreligious, compared with fewer than half, 47% of those who are 65 or older. So it seems that the younger generations are more certain in their views, more certain, those that don't have a religion, that it's not just that, well, I'm not part of a specific religion, but it's effectively that they don't have those kind of religious beliefs at all. Okay, what about religiosity amongst people with a religious affiliation? The highest levels of religiosity are found amongst those with non-Christian faiths, which is what we expected. 23% extremely very religious, 50% somewhat, and Roman Catholics, 18% extremely very, 52% somewhat. Anglicans are typically much less likely to describe themselves as extremely very religious, only 6% as opposed to like the 23%, 18% there, with 40% saying somewhat, and 33% neither religious nor non-religious. Okay. So then it moves on to talk about attendance at religious services and how often people attend religious services. It always surprises me. It says there 2/3, 66% of people never attend ordinary services. It always amazes me how many people do. That 34% are attending ordinary services. Those are services that are not baptisms, weddings, funerals, etc. Given that I can hardly think of anybody I know who attends church services, but these people must be out there, at least that is what they're reporting. What would have been nice to have had some data there would have been to have some age banding. It is known that in church services in the United Kingdom, certainly Christian services, they are overwhelmingly populated by older people, so some age data would have been quite useful there. We then have a table on frequency of prayer, maybe a couple of interesting points here. On the never category, over the last 20 years, it's gone up from 30% to 50%, which is pretty significant jump there, I think. whereas the occasional thing has gone down from 41% to 29%. So it seems that really what has happened is that it's these people who were sort of going through the motions, perhaps. Maybe this is a change along with this hardline thing of people. It's now more acceptable just to not be religious and not to have this sort of cultural Christian baggage thing, and you go through the motions a little bit more. So effectively you are having people who are occasionally just going through the motions and praying for something, and now they're saying, nah, this is just a load of bollocks, this is not what I'm about, so I'm just not going to bother doing that anymore. So again, you have this hardening process. You could also suggest a hardening process at the other end of the scale with the several times a day, going from 5% up to 8%, but I think that's probably more an increase in the Muslim population, because quite honestly, it only seems to be Muslims by and large that can be asked to pray more than once a day. Then we move on to a table on beliefs in the existence of God, which I know will be a little bit controversial to some of you, because we get into this grounds of what is agnosticism, what is atheism, and defining these things. But you've got to look at it in terms of the data that they've put down there. How they are defining atheism is I don't believe in God, which I know some people will say, well, that's a very hard position there, and you can be an atheist without taking such a hard position. But that is the position that they're taking here. And that has gone from 1998, 10%, up to 26% in 2018. And then what they're calling in this report the agnostic position, which is, and I found this a little bit strange the way this is worded, I don't know whether there is a God, and I don't believe there is any way to find out. Why the second clause there was included, I don't know. What about if you don't know whether there is a God, but you do believe potentially there is a way to find out? You're not kind of covered there, are you? So I found that kind of interesting. Then we have these sort of wishy-washy categories. I don't believe in a personal God, but I do believe in a higher power of some kind. I find myself believing in God some of the time, but not at others. How they're supposed to be categorized in terms of this, I don't know. And then while I have doubts, I feel that I do believe in God, and I know God really exists, and I have no doubt about it. So effectively, in terms of this report, you would have to say that the first column there is definitively atheists, and maybe the second column as well, although the report only counts the first column, the 26%. And then those last two, while I have doubts, I feel that I do believe in God, and I know God really exists, and I have no doubt about it. Add those two together, and they would give you a kind of true theism figure. How you include people who believe in God some of the time and not others, I do not know. What is interesting, though, is in terms of the no doubt column at the end, again, we have this hardening of position, don't we? I don't believe in God has hardened its position. But even though there's been a decline in religiosity and God belief, I know there is God really exists, and I have no doubts about it. That figure has pretty much maintained itself, 21% in 98, 19% in 2018. Now, what is interesting, and this is something that I've said time and again when I've always cautioned about this when reading these reports, is that it's very, very, very much depends on how you word the question. And so comparing report to report, or comparing the statistics from one country to another, you have to be so careful as to how it's worded. Listen to this. Let's look through these two tables, because then the next table is belief in God now or in the past. In terms of I don't believe in God, 26% said, yes, that's the option I'm going to choose. But when they were given these different set of alternatives, which is I don't believe in God now and never have, and I don't believe in God now but I used to, well, 42% claim that they don't believe in God now, and either never had or used to, and yet only 26% of people said they don't believe in God. So what that shows here is effectively a fair proportion of that I don't know whether there is a God, and I don't believe there is any way of finding out, and some of that I don't believe in a personal God, but I do believe in some kind of higher power, when push comes to shove, will affiliate with the I don't don't believe in gods. And so effectively, maybe that is a more appropriate number to look at the percentage of atheists in the UK than the 26% that they are claiming. Okay, the report then goes on to say, a further question suggests that even believers in Britain tend to have in mind a rather distant God. Less than a quarter, 23% of people agree that there is a God who concerns himself with every human being personally. Just 2 in 5 Christians hold that belief. How can you be a Christian and not hold that belief? That really doesn't make any sense. So that gives you an idea of where we're at with regard to that. Very, very mixed bag of opinions. And again, it very much depends on how the question is worded. They then went to ask some specific questions about religious beliefs. And when you consider the low levels of religiosity, it's really quite amazing how many people believe some of these things. Effectively, given that there's a fair number of religious people who we know don't believe these things, there must be a fair number of non-religious people who are still believing in these things. Percentage definitely / probably believe in life after death. 42% of the population believe in life after death. 37% believe in heaven. 26% believe in religious miracles. Get this, reincarnation. 20% of the UK population believe in reincarnation. 16% of the UK population believe in the supernatural power of ancestors. What I'm learning from this table is that effectively 20% of the UK population are batshit crazy. I think that's about as much as I can learn from that. What is really interesting with regard to the life after death, because people always suggest that, well, maybe it's old people that are drawn to life after death. It says here, actually, it's not what you think. There may be an age effect at work in the belief in life after death. Not as many suppose that we become more drawn to an afterlife as we get older, but rather the reverse. Perhaps because the time ahead of the young is much greater than the time behind them, life seems indefinite, so young adults tend to believe in some unstudied way that they will carry on forever. As they age, people come to accept that there is an end. As Table 8 shows, only 13% of respondents aged 18 to 24 definitely rule out life after death, whereas people over 55, 26% definitely rule it out. That's really kind of interesting there. That's the exact opposite of what we would have expected, I think. Next, we had a table that showed religious identification, attendance and belief in God by age and by gender. And this was really interesting because we know that there is a disparity between men and women, or males and females as it classes them here. But what is interesting is that in the age ranges that they've shown, and the ranges are a bit squashed, right, because there is a big difference between the 18 to 24s and the 65 to 74s, and it's not really represented in the ranges that they've given there. But what it does show within these three metrics, having a religion, attending religious services or meetings, and belief in God, is that indeed there is a significant difference between males and females, men and women. In terms of having a religion, 41% of males, 54% of females. So significant difference there. But what is interesting in all of these categories is that in the younger age group, the disparity seems to be significantly smaller in terms of percentage than it is in the older category. So maybe we've got some kind of cultural effect there, and maybe as times go on, we're going to see that start to disappear a little bit more. There's always been this kind of idea that women have a more sort of spiritual perspective and are more drawn towards religion and religious ideas, and that may be the case. But clearly the percentages are not as great as they have been in the past, and maybe those percentages will reduce even more in the future. We then moved on to the final section, which was the public's perception of religion. So let me show you the first figure that they showed here, which was a confidence in institutions here. So we're looking at schools and the education system, courts and the legal system, business and industry, churches and religious organisations and Parliament. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. You've got a really big spread of different types of organisation here. And in terms of a sort of lack of confidence, you're looking at the two bars on the right, which is the very little, in the sort of magenta, and then in the cyan colour there, the light sort of, or the sky blue, the no confidence at all. And you can see that churches and religious organisations are about as unpopular as Parliament here, which, given all the Brexit shenanigans, which still appears at the time of doing this, going absolutely nowhere, and the dreadful lack of confidence that people have in that's really a sad indictment on church and religious organisations. And in terms of no confidence at all, they actually fare even worse than Parliament does. We can add a little bit more onto this here when we look at Table 10, attitudes towards religious roles in public life by people who have a religion and don't. Just look at the middle one first. Religious organisations have too much power or too little power. And this is the percentage who believe they have too much power or far too much power. And there's been an increase amongst those that have a religion who think that, but a very large increase from 35% up to 48% from those who have no religion. And I think that is absolutely justified when you realise that the United Kingdom is a state that has a state religion, the Church of England, and that state religion has certain powers, which we've talked about. Of course, the monarch is the governor, the supreme governor of the Church of England, or something like that they're called. We've got the Lord Spiritual sitting in the House of Lords, our upper chamber, and all these state-funded faith schools that the Church of England is in charge of, that allows to run and give a religious character. That is more and more out of place as those religions become more and more marginalised. So I think it's fair to say that they have too much power when they become more and more marginal organisations, yet are still wielding the same amount of power. And at some point, surely that has to come to a head. The question before that, religion brings more conflict than peace. Now, it's still 52% of those who have a religion agree with that somewhat negative statement. 74% of those with no religion agree with that. But what is interesting is that we've become a little bit more tolerant, because if you look, that they've had significant drops. 69% down to the 52%, 81% down to the 74%. So even those with no religion actually don't view with religion with quite the same suspicion in 2018 as they did in 2008 with regard to conflict versus peace. So that is showing a little bit of a softening of attitudes there, which is interesting and in some ways sits at odds with some of the more polarised things that we saw earlier on in the report. So that's with regards to that. We then had a table here, and really we're getting right at the end of the report here. But we had a tolerance of religious difference 2008 and 2018, and this was asking very much a social question, whether you would be accepting of a person from a different religion marrying a relative, and definitely accept 24% of the population in 2008. That has jumped up to 39%, whereas definitely not accept has gone down from 8% to 3%. So that shows a more tolerant attitude. But frustratingly, what this doesn't give us is any breakdown, right, of where that is taking place. Is that taking place within people who have a religious belief? Or is it effectively amongst those of a no religious belief being tolerant of a relative marrying somebody who has a religious belief? We have no way of knowing, and we have no way of knowing whether Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus, for example, are as tolerant of people marrying outside of the religion as are Christians. One suspects the answer would be no, but they haven't given us that data. It's one of those situations where you always think, is that one of those bits of data they deliberately haven't given us because it would sort of give a sort of politically incorrect answer there? I don't know. That isn't the way they function for the rest of this report, but it does have that sort of suspicion over it. And frustratingly, we don't have access to that data, and we won't have for another 12 months. Finally, positive or negative views towards religious groups. You can see here, this was again a bit more surprising. Not surprising that Muslims were viewed more negatively than other groups, and there was a bit of a breakdown there in the statistics. Over 55%, over 55s, 22% I should say, viewed them in a negative light, whereas in the 18 to 34 age group, only 13% viewed them in that light. But Muslims were a bit of an outlier. They were viewed a little bit more negatively than any other group. But still, significantly a lot more people viewed them in a positive light than a negative light. And quite honestly, for all the groups, most people were quite indifferent. I was a bit surprised at what a positive light Christians were viewed in, because I've shown reports in the past where we've looked at things such as political leaders, and the British public have been asked whether their Christianity gave you a more positive or negative outlook on them, or whether their atheism gave a more positive or negative outlook on them. And actually, atheists and non-believers fared better in that context than did Christians. And so viewing it in this different context, it would appear you get a slightly different answer with regard to that. Okay. So that was it for the data, but there was one final little question that they'd asked. And when they'd asked about whether governments should interfere with a religion being allowed to spread its faith in a very general sense without sort of looking at the specifics, 39% agreed that a government shouldn't interfere, 28% disagreed, with a substantial number of neutral or unsure responses. But then they nailed it down a bit. And I think this is quite important when you think about traditional Christian and Muslim views, which have been very antagonistic and very much, their road or the high road, right? And very much viewing other faiths as the enemy in many respects. There are some people, this is what they asked, there are some people whose views are considered extreme by the majority. Consider religious extremists who believe, this is the defining religious extremist, someone who believes that their religion is the only true faith and all other religions should be considered as enemies. Do you think such people should be allowed to publish their views on the internet or social media? Seems incredible to me. 2/3, 68% of people gave a negative answer. Only 22% are ready to allow free expression in these circumstances. It's bizarre to me that somebody regarding their religion as the only true faith is seen as an extreme position. I would have thought that would have been the default position, right? If you believe that your religion is right, then your religion is the only true faith, isn't it? That doesn't seem a particularly extreme thing. And regarding other religions as your enemies, well, of course, that's a bit up in the air, because some people regard their enemies as somebody you should kill. But actually, in politics, your enemy is just the people who hold radically different views to you. If this question had been framed in politics, most people would accept that an ardent socialist would regard an ardent free market capitalist as their enemy, and an ardent free market capitalist would regard an ardent socialist as their enemy. And I'm sure most people wouldn't say, well, these disagreements should be banned. Nobody should be allowed to vent these ideas on social media. So it seems like we're getting into a little bit of a pickle there with regards to religion. And maybe we need to start thinking about what religion really is about, what religious beliefs really are about, and not just seeing as it is this kind of mushy loving, about loving everybody. But these are specific beliefs, specific worldviews, and if you hold that worldview, then you would expect somebody to hold negative views of people who do not hold that worldview, because they are wrong, and perhaps wrong in ways which will have tangible effects were their religion to be true. Just something to think about there. So that takes us to the end of this report. It's interesting. We have these general trends that have gone on. I think what this survey has opened up beyond others is that it's shown this polarization factor. We knew the way that things were going, that religion was on the decline in the UK, that it's specifically Christianity that's on that decline, and that immigration is maintaining, in some cases, increasing levels of other religions. And we knew that the non-religious category was increasing quite substantially. We expected that to continue. But maybe what we didn't know, and what we know now, is that in that non-religious category, attitudes are hardening or becoming more confident, I think is maybe a better way of saying it. That people are not holding these wishy-washy positions, but thinking, no, I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I don't have to try and mollify and sugarcoat that to not offend people. And that at the other end of the spectrum, what we're being left with is a religious group that is not just smaller, but it's more of a hardcore group. It's, again, the wishy-washy people on those side have kind of jumped ship. If you maybe had two parents who were religious but didn't take it very, very seriously, you're one of those people that will have lost your religion. And what is left behind is a more religious kernel of those who made up the larger religious group to begin with. Okay, that's what I got out of this report. If you've made it this far, I'd be interested to know what you think. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you did get something out of it. If you enjoy my work on this channel, I'll leave you the links to my Patreon, etc. Okay, thank you for watching, and bye for now.